Well, welcome to what's now the 13th annual Quentin Skinner lecture. In 2009, thanks to the generosity of Quentin Skinner, the Faculty of History received funding from the International Bolzan Prize Foundation to establish an annual lecture in modern intellectual history since 1500. The principal task of the recipient of this award is to deliver a lecture on a relevant theme of their choosing, as well as to organise and participate in the related symposium. Accordingly, we'll begin today with a lecture on a pivotal figure in 18th century political thought, before proceeding in the afternoon to two panel discussions involving expert scholars in the field, Daniel Van, Rob Douglas, Shiro Lim, and Jennifer Pitts. Well, past occupants of the Skinner lectureship have been, there's a bit of a list here, I'm afraid, Emma Hunter, Avi Lifshitz, Sophie Smith, Teresa Bejan, Anna Becker, Karuna Mantina, Gabriel Paquette, Tim Stanton, Joel Isaac, Hannah Dawson, Isaac Nakamowski, and Katrina Forrester. This year's lecturer is William Selinger, Wick Carey Assistant Professor of Constitutional Studies in the Department of Classics and Letters at the University of Oklahoma. Prior to taking up his position at Oklahoma, Professor Selinger was, between 2018 and 2022, a lecturer in the history of European political thought at University College London. He came there from teaching social studies at Harvard University, where he took his PhD in 2015, having studied with Richard Tuck and Eric Nelson, among others. Before that, Professor Selinger studied for his BA in political science at the University of Chicago. Professor Selinger's first, I have to say, rather brilliant book, Parliamentarism from Burke to Weber, appeared with Cambridge University Press's Ideas in Context series in 2019. The text on which the monograph is based won the Montreal Political Theory Manuscript Award in 2017. The book that followed 2 years later is an ambitious, powerfully revisionist account of a key strain in largely 19th century European political thought. Well, the principal innovation which the work makes is to examine the period precisely through the lens of parliamentarism, rather than in terms of more familiar frameworks of analysis, such as liberalism or democracy. Or, alternatively conceived, the book showed how the histories of liberalism and democracy have been inextricably linked to parliamentarism. In effect, Selinger's parliamentarism posed a bold challenge to existing literature by forcing scholars to reconsider the meaning of a free state in the aftermath of the constitutional ideas of Montesquieu. Central to Selinger's account are figures like Jean-Louis Delhomme, Edmund Burke, Germain de Staël, Constant, Tocqueville, Mill, and Weber, whose political theory centered on the relationship between executive power and a representative assembly which embodied the interests of the nation. Selinger's story linked a reading of 1688 to 1789 and beyond, unearthing a scheme of constitutional thought that combined a number of distinct elements into a system. These included, first, a powerful elective legislative assembly, ministers who formed part of the legislature and depended for their tenure on parliamentary support, third, a constitutional monarch, and finally, a system of competing political parties. So Selinger maintains that a properly historical and analytically precise account of constitutional government between the French Revolution and the First World War brings the centrality and persistence of this model to the fore. Well, besides his first book, William, or Will, Selinger has been a prolific political theorist. His numerous articles in leading journals and chapters in assorted books include work on the history of political ideas course, really, in effect, 3 centuries, spanning, including other figures I've mentioned, but also spanning Montesquieu, Bagehot, Schumpeter, Lefort, and Rosanvallon. These writings are always philosophically careful and historically meticulous. Well, for his current project, Professor Selinger has returned to Montesquieu, planning a major comprehensive investigation of his thought. Today's lecture is, I'm partly assuming by anticipation, is fundamentally dedicated to reflecting on the problematic and fraught relationship between ethics and politics, but via an examination of Montesquieu's early work. So, I invite Professor Selinger to address us this morning, on the theme of love and despotism in Montesquieu's Persian novels. Thanks, Ray.
Thank you, Richard, for that exceedingly generous introduction. It's wonderful to be here to speak about my current research. I'd also like to thank CRASSH for making this event possible, all of you for coming, and all the other speakers and panelists who will be speaking today as well. And although he unfortunately could not be here for this, I'd like to thank Quentin Skinner for endowing this lectureship. I never had the chance to study with Quentin, other than reading his books, but both of my primary PhD supervisors were students of Quentin, so I've always thought of him as a kind of intellectual grandfather, and I'm hopeful my talk today will carry on our family tradition. The figure I'll be talking about today, as Richard has said, is Montesquieu. And I doubt anybody here would deny that Montesquieu, who lived from 1689 to 1755, was one of the most influential political thinkers of modern Europe, indeed of the modern world. His writings influenced Rousseau, Smith, Gibbon, Ferguson, Burke, Kant, Hegel, Tocqueville, Durkheim, Arendt, Sklar, and many others. There is a vast scholarship on Montesquieu, in which he has been described as the founder of liberalism, conservatism, Orientalism, historicism, sociology, and American constitutionalism. Yet despite this extraordinary influence, I suspect few here would deny that Montesquieu remains enigmatic, and that on a pretty deep level, we still don't really understand what he was up to. Partly this is due to the style in which he wrote. His major texts, such as Persian letters and the Spirit of the Laws, are composed almost like chains of little essays, in which it is often not immediately obvious why one essay follows another, or where they are all leading. Montesquieu said on several occasions that what distinguished great writers was that they did not merely tell their readers things, they made them see things, they made them think. And this is what he was trying to do as well. But partly, the enigma of Montesquieu is due to the number of different sources and contexts which are incorporated into his political writing. He was in dialogue with canonical figures in the history of political thought, like Machiavelli, Hobbes, and Cicero. But he was equally in dialogue with travel writers, poets, playwrights, theologians, ministers of state, writers of character sketches like La Bruyere, and with the whole field of natural philosophy, from the heights of metaphysics down to the latest experiments on plants and animals. Of course, authors like Locke or Rousseau were equally conversant in all these different fields. But insofar as they wrote about subjects like love, music, natural philosophy, education, the customs and religious beliefs of non-European peoples, or the first principles of theology, they tended, and I'm just going to say tended, to do so in different books, not in the Social Contract or the Second Treatise. What is peculiar about Montesquieu is that such themes are all there, all mixed together, right? All jumbled together, some might say, all synthesized in the very text in which he set out what we would call today his political theory. Can't sort of shunt all that stuff to the side, it's sort of all there. To read Montesquieu thus demands two things. First, that we follow the sort of complex thread of his book's arguments. And second, as we do that, that we move between all these different contexts and conversations in which his books enter. That is what I will attempt in my talk today. I will be talking about Montesquieu's first major work, Persian Letters, which was published in 1721, and I will be talking about the theme of love. This was a theme of wide-ranging importance during the era of Montesquieu's intellectual formation. Writers who sought to defend the French monarchy of Louis XIV, or to teach French monarchs how to govern, or even to radically reform the French monarchy, were all in agreement that it was of the utmost importance that kings loved their subjects, and that subjects loved their kings. Without love, no monarchy could survive. One of the great theological debates of the final decades of the 17th century was the debate over what was called pure love, over whether it was possible to love God in a purely disinterested way, such that one's own self-interested desire for salvation was not a motivating factor. For travel writers describing non-European nations, or for historians writing about the distant past, nothing was more striking or fascinating than the diverse ways that societies had regulated love, the different forms marriage had taken, and the diverse relations between men and women. More than anything else, this seemed to express the profound variability of human custom and belief. All these different conversations about love feature in Persian Letters. What I will be arguing in my talk today is that Montesquieu wrote Persian Letters to question the idea that love could be made pure. Against much prevailing theological and political discourse, he contended that love was incapable of grounding a system of ethics or of serving as the basis for a political community. Love could neither redeem French absolute monarchy nor found a reformed egalitarian politics. The reason for this was that love could not be made pure. Indeed, Montesquieu suggests the very act of trying to make love pure, and thus capable of serving as the basis for a perfected human community, represses and destroys actual love. Against pure love, Montesquieu would propose a different moral system, in which love enters as one element, but does not serve as the foundational principle. But, and here I think we see again the many layers of Montesquieu's argument. If one aim of Persian Letters was to propose a superior moral system to one based on pure love, another aim was to reveal the limits of any moral system. By the end of the book, Montesquieu has very strongly suggested that even the system he has proposed as superior to pure love will be largely powerless to shape the behavior of rulers. It cannot compete with the forces of vainglory, interest, and power. It was this insight into the limits of morality as an efficacious force in human affairs, I will argue at the end, that set Montesquieu down the path to spirit of the laws. Okay, so that is an overview of my talk, and let's now turn to Persian Letters. And even though I'm sure most people here have read it, probably more than once, I'm going to start with a brief sort of recapitulation. Persian Letters is a kind of novel, that is how Montesquieu would later describe it, in which two Persian aristocrats, Uzbek and Rika, travel to Paris from Isfahan. The book is entirely composed of letters. Letters Uzbek and Rika exchange with each other, letters they exchange with people back in Persia, and letters they exchange with people they meet in the course of their journey. While they're in Paris, they witness the death of Louis XIV and the tumultuous events of the Regency, ending with the radical financial and monetary experiments of John Law. Now, Uzbek and Rika take quite different paths when they get to France. Rika spends all of his time mingling in Parisian society and socializing. Uzbek, by contrast, goes to a country estate and stays largely to himself, studying philosophy. he constructs a philosophy of morals and politics on the model of Descartes' philosophy of nature. Whereas Rica effortlessly adopts French mores and manners, Uzbek is unable to become French. But he's also unable to go back to Persia because of political enemies there who seek to destroy him. He is without a nation, living alone with his thoughts. Persian Letters is a book composed of many genres. First, it is a fictionalized work of travel writing. Just as Jean Chardin or Jean-Baptiste Tavernier traveled to Paris and wrote about what they saw, Montesquieu invents two Persians who travel to France and write about what they see. Second, through the character of Rica, Montesquieu is engaged in writing a work of character sketches. As Rica mingles in French society, he describes what he sees. His letters, which are modeled on the character sketches of La Bruyere, consist primarily of quite funny vignettes that bring out the vices, foibles, amour-propre, and general ridiculousness of French society. Third, through the character of Uzbek, Montesquieu constructs a quite serious system of moral and political philosophy, which counterbalances the more humorous character sketches of Rica. And then finally, to illustrate the philosophy, the book contains a series of fables, little tales that frequently take place in distant and mythical settings. As Uzbek explains early in the book, fables allow truths of moral philosophy to be, quote, felt and experienced, not merely grasped through reason. The most famous of these fables is the tale of the troglodytes, but there are a number of others as well. From a certain perspective, Uzbek himself is a character in a fable. While he is in Paris, his 5 wives remain in Persia, living in a seraglio where they are watched over by eunuchs. Over the course of the book, they become increasingly unhappy, and chafe at the restrictions they are under. Eventually, Uzbek decides to punish them, leading to further rebellion and to the book's tragic ending, the suicide of Uzbek's favorite wife, Roxana, who reveals that she never loved him at all. The opening of Persian Letters is dominated by these two fables, the fable of the troglodytes and the fable of Uzbek's seraglio. I want to now spend some time discussing these two fables, and I will argue that they both communicate the same lesson. Love cannot be made pure, and political community cannot be grounded in love. Let's start with the troglodytes. This is a tale Uzbek invents for his friend Mizra, who has written him to ask whether one should pursue virtue or pleasure. At the beginning of the tale Uzbek invents, the troglodytes are entirely selfish and wicked. They are nearly wiped out as a result, but then they reconstitute themselves because there are 2 men among them who have not forgotten virtue. Under the leadership of these 2 men, the troglodytes become a virtuous and flourishing community. The virtue these 2 men practice consists of disinterested love. They serve their fellow troglodytes, and indeed any human being they can, to the greatest degree possible, without any thought of their own individual gain. We are used to the idea, which would begin to become prominent in the 18th century, that people might pursue their own self-interest and indirectly benefit others. Well, the fable of the troglodytes describes something like the inverse. The troglodytes seek to benefit others, but in the process, they sometimes indirectly benefit themselves. However, the virtue of the troglodytes is pursued without any thought of one's own gain. It is also not based in fear of punishment, since if you act virtuously out of fear of punishment, that would be out of a self-interested motive, out of self-love, rather than out of the love of virtue and service to others. The love of the troglodytes is a kind of universal benevolence. Yet at the very end of the troglodyte story, Montesquieu asks us to view their virtue from a different perspective. Just as Uzbek's wives rebel against the strictures of their seraglio, the troglodytes rebel against their strict morals. They demand a king, And the reason for this is that their, quote, virtue is beginning to weigh them down, unquote. It requires the internal repression of all desire for, quote, ambition, riches, pleasures, unquote. The proposed king addresses the troglodytes as follows, quote, in the condition you are in, not having a head, it is necessary for you to be virtuous despite yourselves. But this yoke seems to you to be too hard. You'd like it better to be subject to a prince and to obey his laws, which are less rigid than your mores, unquote. So the troglodytes rule themselves more harshly than any monarch would. The tale of the troglodytes is about a love for one's fellow human beings that is pure because it is selfless, and which is achieved through internal repression. By contrast, the tale of Uzbek Seraglio is about a very different version of pure love, and it is about love being made pure through actual punishment and actual reward, rather than through internal coercion. Now, I suspect some people may be surprised that I would analogize Uzbek Seraglio to the troglodytes. Montesquieu was obviously not holding up Uzbek Seraglio as any kind of political ideal, but there is a long tradition of scholarship which claims that Montesquieu was unironically promoting the virtue of the troglodytes, and that this was his ideal, even though the troglodytes' virtue is quite at odds with what comes later, not only in Montesquieu's career, but even in Persian letters itself. But in fact, there are a number of parallels between the two fables. Both are about purifying desire. In both, there is rebellion against the effort to purify desire. In both, this rebellion occurs as the community grows in scale. It is Uzbek's departure for France and the extended community this creates, which leads to his wives' rebellion. It is the growth in size of the troglodyte community that likewise pushes them to wish to give up their pure mores and be ruled by a monarch. Both fables are set in locations which were, for an 18th century audience, far off and quasi-mythical. In writing his account of Uzbek Seraglio, Montesquieu drew upon the writings of a number of European travel writers. His most important sources were Jean Chardin's description of the seraglios in which the elite women of Isfahan lived, and Jean-Baptiste Tavernier's extended account of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire's seraglio in Istanbul. In line with these accounts, and particularly with, on this point, Tavernier's, Uzbek's wives are guarded by eunuchs and unable to move freely. With the exception of their husband and the eunuchs who guard them, they are not allowed to see or be seen by any man. If another man sees one of Uzbek's wives, he is immediately killed. All of these details, as I said, were taken from a set of European travel writers. But these travel writers took pains to explain that none of them had ever actually entered a seraglio. No European writer had at that point. So everything they said they knew about seraglios came secondhand. It was in this, quote, unknown world, unquote, as Chardin called it, that Montesquieu constructed his fable of Uzbek. In constructing his tale of the troglodytes, Montesquieu drew upon the Hebrew Bible and Claude Fleury's History of the Ancient Israelites. The tale is set in ancient Mesopotamia, during an era described by Fleury as, quote, close to the beginning of the human race, unquote. It, too, takes place in an unknown world. Chardin was Montesquieu's most important source for constructing the details of Uzbek Seraglio. However, even more important for Montesquieu than Chardin's description of the workings of a Persian seraglio was his explanation of the sort of underlying justification for this institution. According to Chardin, who wrote at great length on Islamic theology and Islamic practice, a key principle of Islam was the ideal of purity. Both bodily purity and spiritual purity were at the center of Islamic ritual, Chardin argued. And it was the application of this same idea of purity to sexual desire, he claimed, that led to the creation of seraglios. Following Chardin, Montesquieu depicted Uzbek seraglio as organized precisely in order to preserve purity. As Uzbek explained to Roxanne in an important letter, quote, when we enclose you so strictly when we guard you with so many slaves, when we hinder so strongly your desires, it is because we know purity cannot be guarded too much, and the least blemish can corrupt it, unquote. But the purity of Uzbek Seraglio is different from the purity of the troglodytes. Whereas the purity of the troglodytes was about entirely transcending self-love and the pursuit of one's own pleasure, the purity of Uzbek Seraglio is about pursuing the correct pleasures. It is about pursuing pleasures that are commanded or permitted by divine authority. Pure objects of desire, pure pleasures, are distinguished from impure objects of desire and impure pleasures. Because Uzbek's wives are prevented from interacting with other men and punished by the eunuchs for any transgression they might commit, in principle, although of course this is not how things work out, but in principle, all sexual desire and all desire to be loved and admired will be channeled toward the permissible love for their husband. Uzbek is not similarly coerced into loving his wives, but there are a number of features of the Seraglio which are meant to strongly encourage him to only seek sexual pleasure and love within the permissible bounds of matrimony. This kind of purity, in which pure objects of desire are distinguished from impure objects of desire, is less demanding than the purity of the troglodytes, in which we are to love all of humanity. It does not require complete selflessness. However, it is more arbitrary. Who gets to decide which pleasures are pure and which aren't? This is the topic of Uzbek's first important philosophical exchange, which occurs on his way to Paris. In this exchange, Uzbek asks about religious law and the restrictions it imposes for the sake of purity, such as prohibitions on eating certain foods. Uzbek notes that everyone finds different things appealing or unappealing. So isn't any code of purity going to be based on the whims of whoever made it? Isn't it going to feel arbitrary to those who have different whims? And because it will feel arbitrary to people, this version of purity cannot be self-regulated, self-imposed, self-legislated, like the pure love of the troglodytes. And it will inevitably require a system of rewards and punishments. Okay, let me pause and sort of summarize where we are. So far, I've argued that in the opening pages of Persian letters, Montesquieu shows us two different strategies for purifying love. The tale of the troglodyte shows us how love can be made disinterested, and thus into a kind of universal benevolence. Though Montesquieu suggests that this requires a high degree of internal repression, internal coercion. By contrast, the tale of Uzbek Seraglio shows how, through a system of rewards and punishments, right, not internal coercion, but external coercion, love can be channeled toward appropriate objects. What I want to now show is just how prominent both of these strategies for purifying love were in the intellectual world in which Montesquieu was raised. So let's begin with disinterested love. This was one of the key ideas of a 17th century religious movement known as Quietism. The position of the Quietists was, as one scholar has very ably put it, quote, "In genuine love, all consideration of self must fall away," unquote. I'll repeat that. In genuine love, all consideration of self must fall away. What this meant, from a theological perspective, was that the fear of hell and the desire for heaven had to be transcended, for both were based in consideration of self. One had to love God in a completely disinterested way, without any care for one's own self, such that one's own salvation was irrelevant. Right? One had to love God no matter what, one's own fate. This entirely disinterested love of God was what the Quietists called pure love. And any love which involved one's own good, and thus which contained a trace of self-love, was impure. This idea of pure love was translated into political theory by the most prominent French proponent of Quietism, François Fenelon, in his book, Les Aventures du Télémaque, The Adventures of Telemachus. Now, this is a book which needs no introduction here, thanks to the extraordinary work on Fenelon by Mike Sonnencher and Isfan Hunt. It's a book about the education of Odysseus' son, Telemachus. an education which is really an education into a political or civic version of pure love. Since over the course of the book, Telemachus learns to give up all personal ambition and to be motivated only by service to his community and to the larger community of mankind. In the course of his education, Telemachus learns about the utopia of Betik, a land in which luxury, wealth, and power are not coveted, and nobody desires more than they need. In Betik, the model for the troglodytes, quote, all love one another in a fraternal love which nothing troubles, unquote. While Betik was beyond the capacity of normal human beings to attain, it was meant to serve as an ideal, which should guide the reform of real monarchies. Les Aventures du Télémaque was a critique of the French monarchy of Louis XIV, derived from Fenelon's theological conception of pure love. It corresponded very closely to the disinterested love of the troglodytes. But as Montesquieu shows us through the fable of the troglodytes, or seeks to argue, this ideal of disinterested love requires a very high degree of psychological coercion and repression. Moreover, he seeks to show us, it is incompatible with a growing and flourishing society. For such a society cannot sustain this sort of mutual benevolent commitment between its members. Okay, turning back now to the other strategy for purifying love, that of Uzbek seraglio. As I have shown, here Montesquieu drew heavily from Chardin, but this strategy for purifying love, the use of reward and punishment to channel desire toward permitted objects and permitted pleasures, also had deep resonances in French intellectual life. Indeed, Fenelon's most important theological adversary, Jacques Benigne Bossuet, who was a committed opponent of quietism, argued that this was the correct meaning of what Bossuet also called, quote, the purification of love, unquote. According to Bossuet, the love of God was not wholly selfless and disinterested. Indeed, human beings were incapable of such a thing. Rather, what made this love, or any love, Bossuet argued, pure, was that it was ordered by divine command. This applied to all pleasures and goods we pursued. If they were commanded by God, they were pure. If not, they were impure. Even though the love of God was self-interested, because we are motivated in large part to avoid eternal punishment and attain salvation, it was, in Bossuet's words, quote, a holy and perfect love, unquote, because God had commanded it. Just as the love of Uzbek's wives for him was pure, not because it was selfless or disinterested, but because it was the kind of love mandated according to divine law. Like Fenelon, Bossuet wrote a political theory that was in many ways parallel to his theology. In his book, Politique tirée de l'écriture sainte, he argued that government, ideally absolute monarchy, was required to use punishment to restrain and cleanse human licentiousness. However, the purpose of this was not simply peace and order, but love. By restraining licentiousness through fear and punishment, the monarch liberated his subjects to engage in the proper forms of love, to love each other and to love him. Quote, the good subject loves his prince as he loves the public good, as he loves the safety of the whole state, as he loves the air he breathes, the light of his eyes, his life, and more than his life, unquote. In turn, the king must love his subjects. Despite possessing absolute power, he must never abuse that power or act arbitrarily. And this is only possible if the king is full of love for those he rules. Bossuet, of course, believed that rebellion and civil war were never justifiable. But as an empirical matter, he warned that they would occur if monarchs failed to love their subjects, and if subjects failed to love their kings. The belief in the supreme importance of mutual love between king and subject was not only expressed by Bossuet, but by a whole series of French writers on monarchy, including Richelieu, Jean-François Senot in his book Le Monarque, Pierre Lemoyne in his book L'Art de Régner. And I should say, I've come to have the feeling this was such an utterly widespread cultural and ideological commonplace that referencing text almost begins to be superfluous, but those are some sort of important texts in which this commonplace is found. And on reflection, I think it would make sense that this would be the case. The idea of a monarch loving his subjects was a way to describe good monarchical rule and to distinguish it from bad monarchical rule, even from tyrannical rule. But it was a way of doing this which did not require there to be intermediate powers or checks or anything like that. Similarly, the idea of subjects loving their monarch was a way to imagine something like consensual government. Government which subjects want and desire, but which in no way requires a social contract or representative assembly. So the passion of love, right, of love of monarchs for their subjects and love of subjects for their monarchs was thus meant to redeem absolute rule on the one hand and absolute obedience on the other hand. Now, over the course of the book, what the fable of Uzbek Seraglio reveals is precisely that love is incompatible with absolute rule and absolute obedience. There is no love in the Seraglio. We come to see that Uzbek's wives do not love him, for love cannot be coerced. Love is a natural and spontaneous passion of the heart. In turn, Uzbek admits that he does not really love his wives. The motive that attaches him to them, he says, is jealousy. He cannot stand the idea of another man being with them, of them preferring another man to him. But he does not really feel any especial attachment to them. Uzbek Seraglio does not only represent the French monarchy. It has many meanings. For example, it's a kind of convent, among other things. But over the course of the book, it increasingly does come to represent the French monarchy. While Uzbek is gone, the rule over his wives devolves on the chief eunuch, a figure very reminiscent of Cardinal Richelieu. The chief eunuch writes repeatedly to Uzbek, telling him that there is disorder and license in the Seraglio, and that Uzbek must adopt a harsher stance towards his wives. The chief eunuch lays out an alternative philosophy of governance, based in fear rather than love. He argues that Uzbek must use overwhelming force against his wives and create a system of spies among them so that they're always spying on each other and monitoring each other and reporting back to him. Uzbek resists these demands, but after the chief eunuch dies, he is eventually persuaded by Soline, a disciple of the chief eunuch, that such actions are necessary. He orders all his wives to be locked up in their rooms and physically punished, leading to the discovery of Roxana's infidelity and to her suicide. The ending of Persian letters represents the victory of what Montesquieu called Machiavellianism. By this, Montesquieu meant both a kind of theory and a specific practice. The theory of Machiavellianism was a, quote, science which teaches rulers up to what point they can violate justice without offending their interests, unquote. And according to Montesquieu, the, quote, unlimited power, unquote, of what Montesquieu called Asian despotism, quote, does not produce more monsters than this unworthy art. Montesquieu believed that Machiavelli's prince, much of the reason of state tradition of the 16th and 17th centuries, and the writings of Richelieu and many of his propagandists had been devoted to teaching this terrible art or science. The specific practice associated with Machiavellianism in France was the coup d'etat. A coup d'etat was a sudden and immoral action, without any forewarning, ordered by the monarch to defend his interests. Famous examples of coup d'etats included St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre, Louis XIII ordering the assassination of Concino Concini in 1613, along with the arrest and execution of Concini's wife, the sudden arrest and execution of Richelieu's opponents, first in 1626, then in 1630, and Louis XIV's sudden arrest of his minister, Nicolas Fouquet, in 1661. Persian letters ends with a coup d'etat, in which Uzbek suddenly and arbitrarily orders his wives imprisoned in their rooms and punished without any real evidence of wrongdoing on the advice of his ruthless minister. The attempt to redeem monarchy through love has failed. Okay, So I realize I've already covered a lot of ground. I've tried to bring out Montesquieu's conviction that love cannot be made pure, his suggestion that love is always partial, always accompanied by jealousy, and that it does not correspond to a single pattern that can be legislated or coerced. We cannot overcome all of this neither through pure disinterestedness, as Fenelon imagined, nor through coercion. And because love cannot be made pure, it cannot be the moral bond of a community. What is now left for me to do is to sketch the alternative system of morals that Montesquieu proposed. Now, Montesquieu had proposed this system on two occasions. First, in Persian letters, and second, in his Traité des Devoirs, his treatise on duties, which he wrote and presented to the Academy of Bordeaux in 1725, but never published, and of which only fragments remain. So, here is Montesquieu's alternative to a moral system grounded in love. First, love and justice are to be strictly distinguished. Justice is a relation of proportionality between actions, which is discerned by reason. It is, as Montesquieu famously said, a rapport de convenance. To act justly means to respond proportionately and fairly to others' actions. Examples of justice involve keeping one's promises, obeying the laws of one's community, respecting the property of others, and being generally honest in one's dealings. Justice does not require love. Love can be a motive for following the rules of justice, but it is also possible to act justly with people for whom one is indifferent or even hostile, entirely out of a sense that it is in one's interest to act justly. For justice is what makes possible cooperation over time. It makes possible enterprises that will ultimately benefit you as well as others. In Persian letters, we get the following sort of humorous example of this. Two men are both seeking to impress others in Parisian society, and they agree to make an alliance and, quote, to work in concert to make ourselves witty, unquote. Each will laugh when the other attempts to say something funny, and they will maneuver the conversation to give each other openings. Both are motivated by their own interests, their own desire to improve their standing. The virtue by which each keeps to their side of the agreement and aids the other, perhaps even, occasionally sacrificing their own opportunities to be witty, is justice. They will act justly because ultimately this partnership will benefit both of them. However, love does not disappear from Montesquieu's system. And in the system of morals that he lays out, the role of love is to make up for the limits of justice. Love can create deeper bonds, deeper relationships that are not possible through justice alone. These are the bonds of family, of political community, and of friendship. This is what the particular love one feels toward other particular human beings can do. Insofar as there is also a certain general sentiment of benevolence and goodwill one feels toward all human beings, and thus, quote, compassion or rather tenderness toward those who are suffering, unquote, even people one does not know. The role of that sentiment is to temper the rigors of justice. This kind of general love or goodwill can humanize penal justice, introducing a spirit of mercy. It also humanizes commercial justice. As Montesquieu hints several times in Persian letters, there is nothing in the principle of justice as a rapport de convenance that would prevent the commerce and exchange of human beings, so long as this exchange is proportionate and reciprocal. It does not violate that conception of justice. It is only because human beings are capable of a kind of love, or charity and humanity, that slavery is unconscionable. Over the course of Persian letters, Uzbek traces out how, in a world where rulers followed the principles of justice and love, understood in this way, the human race would flourish, ultimately benefiting everyone. Liberty, stability, and constitutional balance would arise within states. Peaceful relations would arise between states, and the human race would grow and prosper, achieving continuous population growth. Uzbek also attempts to show how the principles of justice and love are each based in God. While Uzbek develops an account of justice and love, Rika develops an account of two other virtues, decorum and greatness of soul. Decorum is the virtue of acting in an appropriate or seemly way. It is the virtue of social life. And there are no general maxims of decorum as there are of justice. Different societies have different manners and conventions. Different situations call for different kinds of behavior. Different individuals have different roles and abilities. To act according to decorum means to act properly in a given situation in light of all these different considerations. Decorum often applies to issues which do not arise to being questions of justice. For example, how you should dress, how you should converse, and to a certain extent, in Montesquieu's view, to the relations between genders. Whereas Uzbek seeks general maxims of government, which are applicable everywhere, Rika is interested in invoking how radically different societies are in their customs and manners, such that different actions are appropriate in different societies. If one violates decorum, one does not act unjustly, but rather ridiculously, and many of Rika's letters are about people acting ridiculously. To not act ridiculously requires insight into the situation one is in and the kind of behavior it requires. It also requires a degree of control over one's passions. This ability to control one's passions and follow rational insight is the bridge from the social virtue of decorum to the political virtue of justice. The ability to keep to one's duties from the rather limited duties of a social situation and of decorum to the more elevated political virtues, even when one's passions would move you otherwise, is greatness of soul, the other virtue that Rika spends a great deal of time investigating. For his understanding of each particular virtue, Montesquieu drew upon various sources. His account of justice, for example, was taken famously from Leibniz and Malebranche, but he's quite clear in his letters, in his notes, and in the Treatise of Duties itself, that his overall account of the virtues is taken from Cicero. Indeed, he titled the treatise on duties after Cicero's work of that name. Quote, Cicero's on duties had charmed me, and I took it as my motto. And the account of virtue in Persian letters is the same as in the treatise on duties. From Cicero, Montesquieu constructed a framework for thinking about our duties that gave greater room to desire, ambition, and interest than did an account of duties based in pure love. This is not to say that justice, love, decorum, and self-command or greatness of soul make no demands of us. Right? They do. But they are, in Montesquieu's view, more flexible, less arbitrary, and less stringent than the demands of the troglodytes and of Uzbek seraglios. And as such, they are suited to societies that are cosmopolitan, commercial, and free, and which the arts and sciences flourish. Unfortunately, however, that is not the end of the story. There is no question that in his early career, Montesquieu was a moralist, and that he defended a broadly Ciceronian view of morals. One of his targets in doing so was the Christian Platonism of Fenelon. Another targets were Machiavelli, and a figure I've barely mentioned today, who figures quite prominently in the Treatise on Duties, Thomas Hobbes. But running through Montesquieu's writings from this period is a thread of profound doubt about the whole project of moral theory. And it is on that thread of doubt that I would like to close. We need to be clear about what exactly Montesquieu doubted. He was not a moral skeptic. He did not doubt that following the virtues was admirable, that doing so perfected our nature as human beings, and that it led to the common utility of mankind. He recognized that his efforts to ground the virtues of love and justice in God were at best hypothetical. We have no real knowledge about God's nature. But like Marcus Aurelius, whom Montesquieu claimed as his other key model during this period, he believed that a system of morals was compatible with some degree of doubt about God's existence and purposes. What Montesquieu was skeptical about was not the existence or value of morality, but rather the efficacy of morality. In particular, he was skeptical that monarchs could be moved or influenced by moral considerations. There were three reasons for this. First, the passions of monarchs, their desire for glory, their jealousy of their position, their fear of being usurped. These passions were inflamed by their power and not under, quote, the yoke of law, in the way that the passions of their subjects were. Second, the situation of monarchs, who were highly dependent on and easily manipulated by amoral and ambitious ministers. Third, the limits of moral philosophy. Uzbek shows in general terms and in the abstract, that if rulers acted according to their duties, if they behaved with justice and humanity, this would redound to everyone's benefits. But for a given monarch, in a given state, Uzbek can provide no real assurance that acting morally will benefit him or her. A theory of morals can show that justice is admirable, and that in general justice conduces to utility. But it cannot show a monarch that in the current moment, right, or their interests really entirely coincide with justice. One lesson of the fable of the Seraglio, I argued, was that when it comes to statecraft, Machiavellianism triumphs over love. But the conclusion of Persian letters suggests that Machiavellianism will also triumph over Montesquieu's own Ciceronian account of duties. It is impossible to imagine a ruler more committed in principle to justice and humanity than Uzbek. Yet when Uzbek is informed by Selim, the disciple of the chief eunuch, that there is unrest and disobedience in the Seraglio, he orders a coup d'etat. At the end of the treatise on duties, Montesquieu states explicitly with what in the fable of Uzbek he only suggests. He tells us that nothing would be easier than to prove that Machiavellianism, which Montesquieu there calls la politique, is, quote, repugnant to morality, reason, and justice, unquote. But such considerations, quote, persuade everybody and touch nobody, unquote. To overcome la politique, Montesquieu argued, it was therefore necessary not to take a direct route of showing its immorality, but rather to take what Montesquieu called, quote, an indirect route. This was to demonstrate to rulers not why Machiavellianism was wrong, but rather, quote, how little utility they derived from it, unquote. To do this, Montesquieu argued in the treatise on duties, required the study of particular regimes and of the causes that made them possible, the causes that made people assent to rule. Such a study would be based in history, and it would show how the science of Machiavellianism was at best a useless pseudoscience, and at worst deleterious. For the ruler of a moderate regime, such as a monarchy or a republic, aggrandizement abroad and coups d'etats within undermine the very conditions that made those regimes possible. The point, in other words, was to fill in the gap between a general theory of duties and the particular situations that rulers found themselves in, so as to be able to make a stronger case to rulers that Machiavellianism was not in their interest. This project, which Montesquieu first sketched at the end of the treatise on duties, would become the spirit of the laws, which was his effort to make up for the limits of moral philosophy and the limits of love, and to thus overcome Machiavellianism. Thank you.
Okay, we've got a decent amount of time for questions before lunch, and we can begin with Sam and Zyklon.
Thank you for this great lecture. Two questions. First, what should we make of the anonymous publication of the work in 1721? And second, how are we to access the authorial aims or intentions in the Persian letters? So if you take the 1721 edition of the work, the author is in a way everywhere and nowhere, except in this authorial preface or introduction. And the introduction or preface makes no mention of love or purity or political community. And so how we synthesize, as it were, the preface or introduction to the work from the 1721 edition with the interpretation that the book is really about the claim that love cannot be made pure, when all mention of love, purity, and political community kind of falls away from the 1721 edition of the book, and from the introduction. So not from the book, but from the introduction of the book, which is the only place in which the author speaks in appropriate persona.
So I think the anonymous publication, I think it was experimental, would be, I think, my loss on that. It was experimental, and also, you know, it was extremely controversial work. I mean, I didn't really touch on all the religious heterodoxy throughout, and so I think Montesquieu didn't want to get in trouble, basically, was part of it. So I think there was that, and also I think it was a very experimental book. So, you know, in a way, like the treatise on duties, which he never publishes, would have been his attempt, I think, to actually just, you know, in his own voice, say all the stuff in there that was sort of done with a much more stylized experimental form. Now, he doesn't end up publishing Treatise on Duties because, as he says, I mean, his explanation is it just wasn't that good, basically. And it turned out that, I mean, in a way, one way I've kind of thought about it is like, I feel like if someone would just go give a sort of philosophical reconstruction of Persian letters, as maybe I've tried to do, how good is that compared to the actual version? Not that good. And I think that's sort of what Montesquieu realized, that without the sort of the art and the humor and all of that, it's not as great a work. And so that's, I think, so he ends up, it's an interesting point though, that I mean, he never ends up saying all of this in his own voice, right? I mean, he sort of, Persian letters is an extremely complex literary work, and then he sort of decides to sort of say it all in his own words, but he never publishes it, and we don't really have the full thing. So yeah, there's a kind of, I think, so I don't think, I mean, look, I mean, what I'm saying here is my attempt to give my best account of what I think he's doing, to use the language of Quentin Skinner. What is he doing here? And so I've sort of given my account of this, but it's true, Montesquieu never says, this is what I'm doing. So there's going to be room for interpretation, I would say. Yeah.
Adam, you have this.
Okay, well, great. Well, obviously, thanks. That's terribly interesting, predictably. I just wanted to ask a couple, just one actually quick question, which is, you cite all of this in, the responsible thing to do at Cambridge, which is, in the 1725 context, the context of Fenelon, Boston, and so on. But what about the Republican context, both as a sort of a source of text ideas feeding into some of these concerns, that is to say, the concern with civic virtue, love of the Republic? And then moving forward, if we think about some of the developments that happened, so to speak, later in the 18th century, where we do see a kind of confluence of ideas of love, of extreme forms of coercion, and some of the pathologies that can emanate from that. If you think, for example, I think one place where you might see this come together is in the writings of Saint-Just, or in the French Revolutionary idea of fraternité. What kinds of connections do you see? And one question that the question of fraternité poses, which I didn't see a lot of, and I'd love to get some clarification in the talk, is the boundaries. That is to say, who precisely is one supposed to love? This is something that French revolutionaries sort of struggled with. Is it the community, or is it some sort of wider circle?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, it's something I've thought about. I mean, but all of these themes sort of leading into the French Revolution. I mean, even the theme of the coup d'état, in a way, I mean, becomes a big theme then. So, when Montesquieu writes Spirit of the Laws, he thinks we're done with coup d'états, in a way. Like, we've sort of moved on from that sort of period of French history, and of course it comes back. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's a great point. I mean, how this sort of whole set of stuff persists, really, and goes into the French Revolutionary era. I think I'll just sort of say you're right about that. I would say, so I think that I would say the sort of all the figures I'm looking at are all really of the view that you can't just sort of love the Republic and not the rest of humanity. Right, that's kind of, I think, the common thing that, I mean, we see that in Cicero, we see that in Bossuet, we see that in Fenelon, and we see that in Montesquieu as well. I mean, even in the kind of, even in his system, I mean, he's quite clear. What is it that Machiavellianism, what is the kind of core thought that underlies, in his view, Machiavellianism? Right, and it would be, the core thought would be something like this, right? Ordinary moral virtue. Ordinary morals, the morals that, the average human being has, is different from the morals of a ruler, right? So, we're not supposed to engage in espionage on other people, but rulers can, right? We're not supposed to, attack other people and take their things, but rulers can. So if you think there's a sort of divergence between the sort of morals of a state or a ruler and the morals of ordinary people, that is for Montesquieu the chief error, and I think, that's how he defines Machiavellianism. So it's kind of an extremely vague concept, but I think the way to think about it is through that, in my view. So it's like, if an author from the 17th century says that, right, that they then fall for for Montesquieu into this category. And I think what that brings with it, though, is precisely this thought that we can't, we are allowed to have more devotion to our fellow citizens than to other people, but we can't be unjust to other people more than to our fellow citizens. So I think this idea of, it has to be the larger community of mankind or humanity. So I think, yeah.
David Armitage.
Thank you, Will. That was very interesting, and I'm interested in interest. I think in the first half of your talk, the second most used word after love was disinterested.
Yes.
And I wonder whether, in your reading of Montesquieu, you discovered that he has a consistent conception of disinterestedness, as well as his much more complicated response to disinterestedness, which you laid out for us. And if he does, where do we fit him into the remarkably understudied history of disinterestedness, désintéressement, etc.?
Yeah, that's a great question. I feel disinterested, I feel like that's the kind of, I was using that because it's sort of the technical term for talking about pure love during this period. A disinterested love. And interest, and what that means in the sort of pure love tradition is that, you don't get anything out of the love, right? And if you do, it's not something you're allowed to think about, basically, is the sort of, so that's sort of why I was using it in that sense. So I was using it for the sort of Fenelonian position. And, it's a very odd, and I think it's a sort of odd conjunction. I mean, disinterested love. It almost sounds to us like, what in the world could that possibly be, right? I mean, we think about disinterestedness as this sort of, this sort of very rational, reasonable, unpassionate thing, and love is the exact opposite. So that's sort of where I was using disinterestedness, the way in which I was using it. Okay, Montesquieu on disinterestedness. Well, he does not agree with, let me just on this, to be clear, I mean, it's clear he does not agree with Fenelon. I mean, and most people don't, right? I mean, I talked about Bossuet, who's the most famous sort of, critic, but, Leibniz thinks Fenelon is wrong, Rousseau thinks he's wrong, right? And most people throughout this period, including Montesquieu, think, there's really no such thing as pure disinterested love, right? And that, and as Montesquieu says in the Pensées, right, in a very, so I think very short, but I think powerful line, he says, what does Fenelon fail to see? That love is a relationship, right? And so that it's always a relationship, right? And as a relationship, there's always going to be some partiality to it, some interestedness to it. So I feel like he is not sort of interested in disinterest. I mean, I'm saying this now, and I could reconsider it sort of off the top of my head, but my feeling is he's not sort of aiming at disinterestedness. Yeah.
So Mike at the back, Selinger.
In the 1720s and 1730s, there was a kind of technical interest in something called the droit de convenance, which was taken to mean something to do with the degrees to which the boundaries between states and the arrangements within states should be sort of aesthetically and morally appropriate. And you would use this term if you happen to be a follower of Christian Wolff, or people like that who thought that maybe Prussia should take over Germany because they're all German, and why not have a state for the Germans, and something which, in other words, is compatible with some overarching moral principle that all these particular relationships of suitability and appropriateness can be subsumed within. And presumably Montesquieu is not one of those. So the question is then, what is it that the convenance in Montesquieu is supposed to be doing that is different from that? And the suggestion is that possibly it has something to do with justice, and the degree to which justice, unlike many other virtues, or possibly every other virtue, is something that can be enforced. You don't practice generosity or love if you're coerced, but you do what is right if you are coerced. And coercion therefore goes with states, and states just happen to be where they happen to be, rather than arbitrarily parts of some bigger whole. And I wondered how far that might provide a kind of way of thinking about the justice and the love and the boundaries that separate the one from the other in the way that Adam was sort of suggesting. Because, well, there are states, and Montesquieu sort of buys into them in ways that most of these other people tend not to.
Yeah, I mean, I think I would agree with that very much. And I guess I would also suggest that that's also kind of, in a way, what Cicero says about justice, too. So, you know, for Cicero, I mean, property where states are, this isn't like based in nature, it's ultimately based in sort of history and convention, but once it comes about, we are sort of tied to it, and as you say, it brings about a degree of enforcement as well. So, so I think I would agree with what you're with that. I mean, I guess I've sort of taken for granted the sort of basically, you know, the sort of widespread claim that this phrase comes from Leibniz, basically, and that it's sort of that this is sort of where Montesquieu gets this sort of his sort of statement about justice. It's sort of from that kind of metaphysical direction. But I think what you're saying is something I'll have to think about as well. But I think I would agree. Yeah.
Jennifer.
Thank you. So I have a question about your reading of the Seraglio. I think you started by saying that the lesson of the Seraglio is that love can't be made pure and the political community can't be founded on love. But I wondered throughout, and I think you wound up in a sort of different place. It's not clear that love really has a place in the Seraglio at all. It's about policing desire, maybe.
Yeah.
And as you say, there isn't really any love in the Seraglio in the end. Uzbek doesn't love the women, and nobody loves one another. There's no fraternal love whatsoever. There's a lot of backbiting and there's a lot of coercion and hatred, and not a lot of love. So I just wonder whether love has the place that you suggested in the Seraglio story.
I see.
I mean, you might imagine, I think what you ended up saying is that there can be no love in an absolutist system, and that seems like maybe a more straightforward lesson to draw from the Seraglio than the idea that love can't be made pure, or you can't have political community founded.
I see. Yeah, I think I would agree with what you said, but I guess what I would say would be, at the beginning of the story, it seems, you know, the initial framing of the Seraglio is precisely around love, and then I think then it sort of, you know, we come to see as it goes on this sort of absence of love. So, so it's sort of, so what you're describing as the sort of breakdown absence of love, I think is exactly right, but
that doesn't mean political community can't be founded on love. It means that a political community founded on love couldn't emerge in an absolutist system where fear rules. Sorry, that's a good part.
Right, no, I understand, yes.
I mean, one might draw exactly the opposite conclusion, which is a political community, love has a place in the political community, and that's what an absolutist system with no love in it shows.
Right, so I think I would agree that love, for Montesquieu, love has a place in a political community. And you know, it's that, I mean, love, in a way, I mean, so what is his conception of, you know, I sort of said a little bit about this in saying this idea that love makes up for the limits of justice as his approach to this. So basically, I think his account of what the role love has in a political community is that if you're a monarch in a political community, you don't sort of go beyond the enforcement of the law in arbitrary ways. And you, as much as possible, are kind of moderate and gentle in your exercise of power, basically, something like that. And I think he sees that, he's sort of redefining love, I think, in that way, as a kind of complement to justice. would be, I think, his way of putting it. But I think, yeah, I mean, I think I would say that, I think between the Tale of the Troglodytes and the sort of, between the Tale of the Troglodytes on the one side, the Seraglio on the other side, and Montesquieu's, I think, own doubts about love ever being kind of ever being a kind of, in some sense, pure, I think that would be my account of his sort of conception of the limits of love founding political community, if that makes sense. So I think you're right to say that the Seraglio on its own doesn't really, I mean, what that shows us, as you say, is that love and absolute rule are incompatible. So I think I would agree with that, yeah.
Tom Hopkins.
Thanks, Will. It's a question about justice and about different kinds of love. So you've mentioned a couple of times the idea that he's taken his conception of justice from Leibniz and Hobbes. There we've got the idea of justice as a refinement of charity.
Yeah.
But the question then is does your account of justice as a complement to love go hand in hand with the idea of justice as a refinement of love? And then linked to that, if we are thinking about justice in relation to charity, I wonder about charity compared to different kinds of love. So you've been giving us a story about sexual desire on the one hand and about charity on the other. Do you see charity as a kind of desire? And if so, a desire for what?
Yeah, that's a great question. Right, so I think, as I said, so one thing I said that perhaps I could unpack more is this thought that justice, so justice and love being distinct, but at the same time interrelated in various ways, right? And so I think one way they're interrelated, which is the way I kind of emphasized, was sort of love making up for the limits of justice. And that you don't, and I sort of also emphasized, you don't need love to be just, right? You can be just out of a sense of interest alone, or it's the ultimate motivation. But it's also the case that you can get, that love can lead to justice too, I think. And I think that's exactly, so, and on that way, I think it's also the case that charity, as you precisely say, charity is justice that can also kind of follow from charity. And I think the way in which this comes out in Persian letters is through Uzbek's attempts to ground these principles in God, right? I mean, so there are two basic, in the book there are two principles, he says, we know come from God, right? One is justice, and one is love or charity, right? And so how do we know? We know God is just because it's sort of in the very nature of God, Uzbek says, to be just. God is impartial. He had no reason to be unjust, so unless he was totally wicked, we can expect he'd have to be just. How do we know charity and love are based in God? Well, he sort of has a similar kind of a priori proof of that as well. So basically, but it goes something like this, we know whatever our religion is, we know God created religions, right? We have a religion, that means God created religion. Well, why did God create a religion? He would have done it to benefit and help humanity. Therefore, we know God wants to benefit and help humanity. Therefore, we know through a godly thing to do would be to be good to our fellow human beings, right? And so, so there is, I think, an attempt to sort of ground both of them together, and the book moves from charity to justice, right? So first, Uzbek develops his own account of charity, and of of love, right? Which really is ultimately a kind of account of religious toleration, actually, is really what he derives from that. And then once he's sort of given us this account of charity, he moves on to justice. And so I think there is a sense in which he is there is a sense, I think, as well, in which justice is a kind of refinement of love or charity too, right? So it's I think a bit of both. It's sort of from a philosophical perspective, you're beginning from sort of first principles, like imagining a kind of perfect, if we were to imagine a perfect God, right? What would that God be like right? And well, they would love human beings. They would and then justice would kind of follow from that as well, right? So I think he's kind of working within that territory, although I don't know that, I don't know that, so I mean, that's sort of, I think, how they sort of relate there. And let's see, so, okay, and then, no, I think it's a really good point about the sort of, what is the relation between the kind of charity, between sort of, let's say, charity, compassion, that sort of love, and sexual love, sort of I take to be the other good question. So, I think it's definitely, I mean, I guess I would say that I do think probably for Montesquieu, I mean, it seems clear that he, ultimately, I think he does want them to, there's sort of, I think, I'm not totally sure, to be honest, whether he would say they're kind of all of like, one piece, and sort of a spectrum of different loves like that, or whether he would, in the end I sort of described this, I do think there is a distinction for him between love we feel for particular human beings, of different kinds, so friendship, familial love, that sort of thing, sexual love, and then a kind of sort of very general sense we have of like not wanting other human beings to suffer, basically. And it's even if we don't know someone and we see them suffering, we want to help them, right? And that there's some kind of sense of goodwill we have towards just other human beings as human beings. So I do think probably in the end he would want to sort of distinguish these. I don't know, I mean, I think unlike, Rousseau or Smith, I don't know that Montesquieu ever really works out a kind of psychological account of that other kind of love and what it is. I think that he, I do think in the end probably they end up being distinct for him, but I don't know that he ever explains what this other thing really is, this sort of humanity. I mean, it certainly underlies a great deal of his whole political thinking, right? I mean, even in, when he talks about slavery in Spirit of the Laws, right? I mean, what does he say? He says, obviously, I can't, it sort of offends my sense of humanity, right? I mean, if I were to just sort of follow my method here, I would have to say that in some cases, due to climate and other stuff like that, perhaps slavery would be appropriate, but I can't say that. It sort of offends my sort of sense of love and charity for other human beings. So I think it's very important, this kind of more general kind of love for him. But I don't know that like unlike I think other thinkers, I don't know that he ever actually tries to analyze it. Although, yeah.
Thank you for this paper. My question is about where the project is going, and about the claim you made towards the end that the spirit of laws is about persuading monarchs not to be Machiavellian. And I guess my question is how you plan to relate the eventual claim of your project on the spirit of laws to the scholarship on the spirit of laws that we have, which states or kind of argues, to my mind, and people like Mike have written about this, and others, Anneli Dedine, that the point of the spirit of the laws is not to kind of persuade monarchs to do anything, it's to kind of preserve and conserve these structures which he finds in the feudal system, in the feudal monarchy, to keep monarchs out, and to keep or to kind of package their authority in such a way that their arbitrary prerogative can't actually intervene in the operation of everyday people's lives.
Okay.
So it's about kind of ensuring that the kind of prerogative of the monarch isn't really a problem or even a question. How would you deal with that?
Okay, great. Okay, so where is the project going? That's a good question. So, well, I mean, at the moment I'm sort of envisioning it's a book, right? A book. Probably 4 parts. Part 1, Montesquieu the student. Part 2, Montesquieu the moralist. Part 3, Montesquieu the historian. Part 4, Montesquieu the legislator of nations. That would be the sort of structure. And, you know, wanting to sort of, at each stage, look at sort of all the kind of different contexts that Montesquieu is involved in, but also to sort of tell a coherent story over the whole thing, with, I think, the theme of Machiavellianism being one of the themes that goes the whole way through. I would agree with much of what you're saying. And then moving to, I don't know that my reading of Spirit of the Laws actually is at odds with your reading, or whether they're just sort of working on different levels, if that makes sense. So, I definitely think that everything you said is correct. I mean, let me just say maybe a bit more about why I would say this about Spirit of the Laws. I mean, so, I guess what's striking to me is that it is in the Treatise on Duties that we first get Montesquieu, laying out the kind of framework of what would become Spirit of the Laws. And it's in his critique of Machiavellianism there, right? So that's kind of where we first see him develop this thought. Now I would say that it's interesting. So one difference between Treatise on Duties and Persian letters is the sort of form, but another is, I think, the weight of who sort of Montesquieu's opponent is, right? And so in Persian letters, I think it's very much like against Fenelon, basically. Whereas Treatise on Duties, it's against Hobbes, right? And so there really are two different, and against Hobbes and against this thing he calls la politique. So those are kind of the two opponents. So against Hobbes, he lays out a theory of, of a kind of limited monarchy and of a kind of social, through an original compact, right? Limited monarchy through an original compact is kind of the argument he lays out there. And then against Machiavelli and against la politique, he gives this account of, a kind of empirical study of legitimacy. So whereas against Hobbes, it's a more philosophical, normative account of legitimacy. Against Machiavelli, he lays out a more empirical account of legitimacy. Why is it that people assent to be ruled? Why do they sort of form states? He says there's a kind of spirit or passion that leads them to do this. This spirit, though, is going to be based on a number of different factors. A whole set of general and particular causes will go into it. Basically, your job as a ruler is to not disturb all of this, right? If you disturb all of this, then you're in bad shape, right? And what does Machiavellianism teach you to do? Either it's a kind of pseudoscience of, not teaching really anything other than to sort of look smart, or it's basically getting you to disturb all these conditions, right? So that's kind of his critique there. And I think he thinks that by showing the sort of complexity of conditions that make up for any sort of state working, right? People sort of assenting to government. I think by showing that, he thinks he can kind of show, basically sort of, in a way, dissuade states from Machiavellianism. That would be sort of the argument I'm making. Now, by the time it gets to Spirit of the Laws, I would say the sort of normative attack on Hobbes has largely dropped out. I think by this time he's studied Pufendorf more thoroughly, and he's come to the view sort of Pufendorf has already done this thing, right? This sort of, we don't need a kind of anti-Hobbesian account of sort of social contract or something like that. We don't need that. What we do need, though, is an account of statecraft still, right? This sort of anti-Machiavellian account of statecraft that would show rulers how to govern, right? That's still missing, right? And so I think that is kind of what he sort of is working on all this time. Now, but I would of course agree with you that what does this mean for a French ruler? Yes, I mean it's precisely, as you say, like don't sort of upset the sort of this complex system that we have, basically. I mean, don't do so financially and don't do so militarily, right? So I think my reading and that reading would broadly align. I mean, I didn't talk about John Law much today, but it's interesting how there's a clear parallel, in my view, between the sort of beginning of the tale of the Seraglio and the Troglodytes, right? There's equally clear parallel, obviously Montesquieu is making it, between the end of the Seraglio tale and John Law's system, right? These two things, clearly he's saying there's something, these two things are parallel, right? I mean, that one ends the French side of the story, one ends the Persian side of the story. So, and there's a way in which I think he does see this as also, in a way, a kind of coup d'etat, what Law is doing. In Spirit of the Laws, he refers to money operations. I mean, not as coup d'etats, but as coup d'autorité, which is, you know, I mean, it wasn't a word I was as familiar with, but as I looked into it, it clearly has the meaning of coup d'etat as well. So I think he sees that kind of, that is also a kind of Machiavellianism. I mean, okay, one other thing, I feel like I'm just now speaking, but...
Just to say, we do 3 other questions.
Okay, so maybe I will stop and let...
So let's take a bit of extra time
Okay.
to get into 3, but
Sure.
bearing in mind that we're at time.
Yeah.
So it's, first of all, the gentleman in the checked shirt behind John Donne, then John Donne, and then Savannah, and we'll end there. Okay?
There is one more very important passion for Montesquieu, and perhaps even more important for Machiavelli. It is fear. How does he balance fear and love, especially in view of Machiavelli, who prefers fear as a point for the community?
Is the mileage of taking them together, do you think?
Sure.
Yeah. John, should we take you in Savannah, and then he can respond to a troika?
It may not work very well, but let me try and say what I wanted to ask, which was who exactly do you think he was talking to? What was his audience? It's a very distinctive genre that Persian, very unlike this we did. Yes, I mean, Montesquieu the student, Montesquieu the moralist, I mean, Montesquieu the student is how it all became possible, but Montesquieu the moralist, what was he trying to do? I mean, to enhance the morals of the French reading literary public. I mean,
Yeah.
Can you do a bit of that?
Yeah, great. And Savannah?
You make a number of equivocation in your talk, which makes it very interesting but also problematic. So one that might look minor is the troglodytes and the Seraglio. The Seraglio is part of Uzbek's reality. It's not a fable the way the troglodyte looks. So there's a literary equivocation that is problematic. I wanted to, so I'll try to be as brief as possible about the love of God. The love of God is difficult, not because of self-interest, but overriding one's desire to be in heaven, avoid hell. That's the least problem of loving God. The problem with loving God is one doesn't know. So you said, God must be just and so on. But actually, we don't know whom or what it is that we love when we love God. And to go back to David's very important question about disinterest in love is epitomized in our civilization, and I suspect others, wanting the good of the lover, or the loved object, regardless of what it does to us. And that is not something possible in relation to God. You can't want God's good well-being. It means nothing. This is why people spend their entire lives in all kinds of religion worrying about what it means to love God. So the equivocation, I don't think, works.
Okay, so fear. Yes, fear is a very important passion for Montesquieu as well, I would say. Certainly. So, I mean, I think, look, I mean, what distinguishes despotism for Montesquieu is it's the rule of fear, right? And so, I mean, yeah, and so basically if, we need some, and I think he thinks we need certain passions that would move us not to be afraid. And so honor, virtue, that's what these are. So I think in that sense as well, I think he is, this is I think why he is anti-Machiavelli and anti-Hobbes in large part. I mean, it's precisely because he thinks fear cannot be the principle of government. I mean, so, and it would be a universal principle that would sort of undermine the distinctions between the different regimes, between moderate regimes and immoderate regimes. And he actually says this quite explicitly. It's sort of a passage he eventually deleted and didn't sort of put into Spirit of the Laws, which he says, one of Machiavelli's problems is he doesn't realize the difference between regimes, and that different regimes depend on different kinds of passions, require different kinds of rule. And this also, I should say, sort of maybe somewhat inspired by Silvana's comment, is why he's so against atheism as well, right? I mean, even he thinks that sort of if we were to really ever be truly, he thinks being moral is it's compatible with quite a degree of skepticism. But the moment we are 100% sure that there is no God, no divine being, that this is just all there is, and that death is 100% the end, at that point he thinks it's impossible to sort of display most of the virtues, right? Because we will be so terrified. So I think from that perspective, I think he is quite concerned about the passionate fear, and in a way, what he's trying to do, I think, quite a bit of is to sort of find ways for us to not be so moved by it. I think, okay, so that's so moving on to John Dunn's question, who is the audience? What was the role of the moralist? Yeah, so this is, I mean, it's something I sort of changed my view on, I would say. I did kind of, I think, wrongly read Montesquieu for quite a while during this period as a straightforward moralist. But I think the talk shows that, I mean, I don't think that's really what he's doing. So I think, I've kept that term, but I think maybe more like, I'm not, skeptical moralist, something like that. Playful moralist, right? I mean, I think he is a moralist, but I think he's quite, the whole time, he's quite, quite sure he's not going to actually probably persuade anyone to be moral, and sort of more exploring what it would mean. On the other hand, I mean, he was quite, I mean, there's a piece he wrote on Cicero around 1715, in which he does really express quite an amazing admiration for Cicero as a real moralist. So I think he did think that, this was a worthy project, but I think you're right, it's not really what he's trying to do. And I don't, I think a lot of what he's doing during this period is writing things that, where there's this kind of strange combination of, on the one hand, what we take to be sort of political thought, moral thought, with the goal of persuading people to act differently, right? Sort of, as we're sort of, I think, from trained to look for. And I think if you just begin with Spirit of the Laws as the first thing you read, and you read most of that, and then you move back, you sort of just see a continuous project of him trying to do that. But I think there is a really very different kind of thing going on with the earlier stuff, where he's not trying to really, you could look at, if you just look at what Uzbek says in Persian letters, it's a kind of theory of statecraft, theory of moral statecraft. But then you're like, and then you could be like, this is like Spirit of the Laws, but it's obviously not written to persuade monarchs to be moral. So I think it's a much more kind of playful, rhetorical genre, right? I mean, another way of putting it is, he really moves from these sort of rhetorical categories, like sort of drawn from Cicero, rhetorical aims, a sort of playful, rhetorical, literary approach, to a bit more of a kind of more approach, more drawn from natural philosophy, based in nature, more interested in necessity, right? I mean, more interested in necessity as opposed to sort of a more playful approach. I think there is this difference that occurs. Perhaps moralist is not the right way to capture that early combination of sort of a playful genre with kind of sort of attempts to persuade the readership to be moral while also kind of making fun of it as well. So And then let's see, for Silvana, let's see, well, I guess on the Seraglio and the Troglodytes, I guess, I don't know. I mean, I think I made the best case I could. I mean, you're right, one is part of Uzbek's lived reality. The other is this tale he makes up. But I would say, from our perspective, Uzbek's lived reality is a tale as well. So I think Montesquieu there, it is, I would say, Montesquieu's own fable, perhaps. And I don't know, I tried to lay out what I saw as the parallels. I mean, I can repeat them, but I think, you know, perhaps we'll just not be in agreement on that. For the love of God, let's see. I would agree, obviously, it's an extremely complex question. I was only sort of talking about one element of it that sort of entered into my argument. I guess, but maybe let me sort of raise this to a slightly, let me sort of put it a different way. I mean, one question is, insofar as Uzbek is, insofar as Montesquieu, with the sort of troglodyte tale, and with the sort of whole thing going on with Uzbek and the Seraglio, insofar as these are about love, if you sort of would accept, if I've made that case, and if I've further made the case that the sort of discourses about love he's talking about are ones that are also, to some extent, inflected by or come out of theological debates. So if I've made that case, is Montesquieu here just sort of dealing with this on the level of human love, ethics, right? Is that what he's interested in? Is he interested in sort of Fenelon's political theory and in the idea of love and monarchy in political moral theory? Or is he himself commenting on the love of God? Is that kind of the theme that this is all about? I mean, is Uzbek, in addition to being a monarch, a kind of God, for example? The eunuchs as priests, for example, to take this to the farthest possible extent, right? And so is there a kind of theological speculation on it? Now, I kind of tend to think not, right? And so that I don't think Montesquieu really is actually here dealing with the love of God as a theme in this, other than insofar as it's ended up sort of, you know, as I said, shape the way people during this period are thinking about love and ethics of human beings toward each other. So I guess so, which is all a way of saying that I guess I sort of would agree with you, it's a much more complicated issue. I've sort of picked, I think, the parts that were, I think, relevant for what I think Montesquieu is doing here. I'm not sure that I think he thinks, you know, I don't think he's that interested on the whole in this sort of whole question of the love of God. I think that's just not kind of one of his big questions. I mean, I think he's just much too much, I think, of a skeptic about anything we could know about God and our relation to God, for that to really be kind of central to his argument. So, but I take your point that obviously it's a much larger question than just the debate over pure love. So, thank you.
We break for lunch now. We'll reconvene on time, but meanwhile, let's thank Wilfred.